Hello. Today we're going to be talking about Objective 11.2, Mendelian Inheritance. Explain how probability can be used to predict traits. Mr. and Mrs. Jost asked us to help them out with a little genetics issue that they're having. If you don't know who Mr. and Mrs. Jost are, Mrs. Jost used to be Miss Landers when she started teaching at West Lafayette about 6 years ago. She used to teach chemistry and Science 8, and now she just teaches Science 8. And Mr. Jost teaches AP Government and US History. They bonded over a mutual love of running, and they coach track and cross country together. And Mr. Jost takes students on a field trip to DC, and Mrs. Jost chaperoned for him. And that's a picture of them from running the Indy Mini Marathon. Then on June 9th, 2018, they wed and officially became Mr. and Mrs. Jost. And now they're thinking about having kids, but they want to know the probability of what their offspring will look like. So I'm hoping that you will use your knowledge of Mendelian inheritance to help them out. Starting off with this problem, the ability to enjoy running is a recessive trait. What are Mr. and Mrs. Jost's genotypes? And by the way, they love running if you can't tell from the pictures. Since the ability to enjoy running is a recessive trait, both Mr. and Mrs. Jost have to be homozygous recessive. If it's recessive, they can't have any dominant alleles. Another problem. Mr. and Mrs. Jost ran the Chicago Marathon together in October of 2016. Let's pretend that Mr. Jost is homozygous dominant for winning and Mrs. Jost is heterozygous. What are the chances their children will inherit the winning trait? We can figure this out by doing a Punnett square using these genotypes right here, homozygous dominant and heterozygous. We can draw a Punnett square, and then I put Mr. Jost genotype up here and Mrs. Jost over here, although it doesn't matter. You could have put the mom and the dad flipped. And this actually represents the alleles in his sperm cells, and this represents the alleles in her egg cells, and they combine, and this could be one possible offspring, another possible offspring, another possibility, and another possibility. And how did I fill out the chair? You basically bring the letters down and you bring them over. So where I wrote W on top, I brought it down and down. W on top, I brought it down and down. And then this W, we brought it over and over, and this W, we brought it over and over. And then we can look at our four possible offspring and analyze them a little bit. One thing that you want to do is take a look at the different genotypes and notice that we have homozygous dominant and we have heterozygous. Homozygous dominant means they're both the same and they're both capital. Heterozygous means different, so one capital, one lowercase. You can write the different genotypes as a ratio. So we have 2 that are homozygous dominant and 2 that are heterozygous. That gives us a ratio of 2 to 2, which we simplify to 1 to 1. And then what are our different phenotypes? There's only one in this case, winning, because every single offspring has at least one dominant allele. All 4 of them will have that same phenotype of winning. So our phenotypic ratio will be 4 winning. And to answer the question, there's a 100% chance that their children will inherit the winning trait. Yay for them. Here's another one. Mr. Jost graduated from Purdue University in 2012, and Mrs. Jost graduated in 2014. If both of the Josts are heterozygous for the Boilermaker gene, how many of their children will inherit a Boilermaker allele? Why don't you take a minute, pause the video, and work it out? And hopefully we came up with this Punnett square where they're both heterozygous. And then if we look at our genotypes, we have 3 different genotypes this time. So we have homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. So if we write that as a ratio, it would be 1 to 2 to 1. We always write in the order of first homozygous dominant, then heterozygous, then homozygous recessive. The phenotypes or the physical appearance. Both this 1 and 2 go for Boilermaker, and then this recessive is not a Boilermaker. So this is interesting because our genotypic ratio and our phenotypic ratio are different. The genotypic ratio is 1 to 2 to 1, but with the phenotypic ratio, we don't have to differentiate between homozygous dominant and heterozygous, so we just say 3 Boilermakers, 1 not a Boilermaker. When you look at a person, you see their phenotype. You don't have any way of knowing if they're homozygous or heterozygous just by looking at them. So to answer the question, 3 out of 4 children will inherit at least one Boilermaker allele. Yay! Here's some funny close-ups of them. Mrs. Jost's earlobes are unattached, which is a dominant trait. Mr. Jost is recessive. His earlobes are attached. What are the possible phenotypes of their future kids? Now we can do a Punnett square here, but notice we were not given the genotypes. We're just told that Mrs. Jost is dominant and that Mr. Jost is recessive. So take a minute, pause the video, think about the possibilities, and work it out. Hopefully you realized that since Mrs. Jost is dominant, she could be heterozygous or homozygous dominant, and we don't know which one. So whichever way you worked out the problem is fine. If you decided that she was homozygous dominant, then we have one genotype, big E, little e. So our genotypic ratio is all 4 big E, little e. And we have one possible phenotype, unattached earlobes, and the same phenotypic ratio, 4 unattached. So if Mrs. Jost is homozygous dominant, the only possible phenotype is unattached earlobes. If you decided to make her heterozygous, we have a bit more variety here. So we have 2 different genotypes, big E, and little e, little e. So we have that same ratio we had before where it's 1 to 1. And then the phenotypes in this case can be unattached or attached earlobes, and I get a ratio of 1 to 1. So if Mrs. Jost is heterozygous dominant, then her children could display the attached or unattached phenotype. And they wanted to thank me for helping them solve all the genetic problems. Nice work. A note before you go, did you notice any patterns? Because in reality, there's only 3 different types of Punnett square problems I can give you, and they're always going to have the same results depending on what they are. So these 3 out here, you can cross a homozygous by a homozygous, and all 4 are going to be exactly the same, like in the example with Mrs. Jost where we made her homozygous dominant. You can cross a homozygous by a heterozygous, and you're always going to get this 1 to 1 or 50-50 ratio. You can cross a heterozygous by a heterozygous, and this is like the interesting one. We have 3 different genotypes, and where the genotypic ratio is different from the phenotypic ratio. If you want, instead of doing Punnett squares, you can just kind of memorize this pattern, and then as soon as you look at the problem, you automatically know what the offspring are going to be. Let's do a practice problem with that where we actually use the fractions instead of a Punnett square. What are the when you cross brown eyes with blue eyes? And I'm telling you the brown eyes are heterozygous. So this is a cross of heterozygous by homozygous. So if we can think in our heads, when you do that Punnett square, half of them are going to be big B, little b, and the other half are going to be little b, little b. So we know that it will be 50% brown eyes and 50% blue eyes. You can also use this fractions technique to study 2 traits at once. So let's look at the traits of eye color and whether or not you have freckles. So here's our mom with brown eyes and freckles, and here's our dad with blue eyes and no freckles. And the question is, what are the chances of them having a baby with blue eyes and freckles? And I put like F line because it doesn't matter if he's homozygous dominant or heterozygous, as long as there's one dominant allele, they'll show that dominant trait. So start by analyzing this separately, looking at just eyes and then just freckles. So starting with eyes, up here we have mom heterozygous and dad is homozygous. So I know a heterozygous by a homozygous cross gives me 50-50. And then for freckles, mom is heterozygous and dad is homozygous. So we get that same ratio coming on here. So what's the chance of having blue eyes? That's what the question asks. Well, we calculated it was 1/2 or 50%. What's the chance of having freckles? We also calculated right here that it would be 1/2 or 50%. Then you're going to actually multiply those two together, and that tells us that there's a 25% chance of them having a baby with blue eyes and freckles. This is also known as a dihybrid cross. When we were only doing one trait, that was monohybrid, and this is a dihybrid cross. You can do it as a giant Punnett square. I just think this multiplying fractions method is simpler. And we'll do one more example of this. So same mom, same dad, but this time the question is the chances of them having a baby with brown eyes and freckles. Why don't you pause the video and then work it out? And then hopefully you started by analyzing the traits separately, like we did before. And then the chance of having brown eyes is going to be, oh, I'm just noticing right now that's a typo because that should be a little b. So capital B and then little b. So, but the chance of them having brown eyes is going to be 1/2. And then the chance of them having freckles, and look, I made the same typo again. I don't know what I was doing there. But anyway, the chance of them having that is going to be little f, and then we multiply them together, and we come up with a 25% chance of them having a baby with brown eyes and freckles. So please let me know if you guys have questions with this stuff, and don't be afraid to try it out and then get it wrong. Thanks for listening.